We are talking to Jennifer Silva, the author of the book, We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America. Let's see if I can get this in frame. There we go. So, Jennifer, I wanted to start off by asking you to just give our viewers a description of your book, We're Still Here. What was the purpose of the project and who are the subjects of the book?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And so I started this research in 2015, and I wanted to address the age-old question of why working class people seem to vote against their own interests. We know from lots of statistical research that people who are poor, ethnic and racial minorities, younger people tend to either not vote or vote for candidates who seem to go against their economic interests. For example, the Republican Party that would support business over labor. And I was just interested in understanding this phenomenon, but I wanted to do it by emphasizing people's identities and the stories they tell about themselves and how they make bridges between their own life experiences and the political sphere. So I wanted to start with this idea that we don't really understand interests until we talk to how people understand their interests from the viewpoint of their own lives and their own identities. So I entered into this coal mining community in Pennsylvania, and I began with talking with white working class people who had experienced the heyday of coal. They had, their grandfathers were coal miners and had also been watching for maybe 2 generations how the jobs went away, and then families started suffering from addiction or from mental illness because of the lack of jobs, and trying to understand how they dealt with decline. But then on top of that, it turned out that even though this had predominantly been a very white area, there were Black and Puerto Rican people who were moving from cities into this area because the rent was very cheap. And so I also then kind of unexpectedly got to see racial tension playing out in rural America, which is also a national trend of increasing diversity in rural America, and to also understand how both race and class shaped people's identities.
So as a kind of follow-up to that, I noticed in your book, as you were saying, you mentioned that you started off by kind of thinking that your focus was going to be white working class Americans, in rural Pennsylvania. And you say something to the effect of, I wanted to focus on those that identify as conservative, but then you go on to say that, well, people didn't really break down that neatly. Actually, people were way more disconnected from the political process and from political labels than you had originally imagined. So can you talk a little bit about how you kind of started realizing that, or how you sort of entered into speaking about politics with your interviewees?
I think I had the totally wrong idea. I was looking for this idea of kind of white working class conservatives who liked the Tea Party or who watched Fox News and, we're all about supporting big business and we're kind of culturally conservative. And so then I started talking to people, and, in Pennsylvania, there is this rich history of union organizing, and sort of there is a story to be told about fighting against the coal companies and exploitation. And so the people I talked to, basically no one was like, yes, we support the Republicans. Instead, they were actually very critical of economic exploitation. And they were very critical, for example, of politicians who they thought, had these deep pockets because they were bought off by corporations. They were extremely critical of the ways that, laws in the US have favored businesses and, at the expense of workers. And they'd say things like, how are you ever going to support a family on $9 an hour? Why is college so expensive? Like, kids have no opportunity today. And so they were very economically critical. And so on my whole kind of story that I started out with ended up being so wrong. And there's always caused a little bit of panic for me in the field because all of the categories I thought I would use weren't working. And it ended up being like a much more complicated story of distrust, and also distrust and alienation in their own lives, that would lead to the kind of distrust and withdrawal from politics at a national level.
Yeah, one of the central themes in the book that you start to get through reading these really powerful, like, vignettes into people's lives is the way that they balance narratives of personal responsibility or personal development or, self-help with the dissolution of social services or social institutions that might provide a foundation for the things that they seem to prize. So there's this tension between the rugged individualism that a lot of these people use to cope with their circumstances and make virtue out of their suffering, and then the desire to say, I want to enter into nursing school, and getting caught in these predatory processes. Can you talk about the way that the institutions that they do have recourse within kind of shape their sense of self-development, their opportunities, and then further demobilize and alienate the people that enter into them?
That's such a good point. So I think sometimes we think about distrust and alienation almost as psychological problems. Like, people have given up and they're fatalistic and they don't understand that they have a voice. And I would say that they're actually quite rational, because the people I interviewed kind of from childhood, they have learned over and over again that institutions that are supposed to help them end up being sites of betrayal and actually hurt them. And that might be, for example, foster care systems. It might be, early experiences, especially for people of color in the criminal justice system and schools, where, they're kind of pushed out of schools and they're, accused of crimes and just seen as deviant from the beginning. And they certainly experience just, corruption and betrayal, for example, in for-profit colleges, where they end up in tons of debt but don't actually have any skills. The list kind of goes on. And, for them, it's very rational, I would say, to not put your trust in politicians or not put your trust in big institutions, because if they end up hurting you in the end, you do have to sort of, for them at some point, say, I am on my own. Like, maybe that's not how it should be, but if I want to make it in life and I want to survive and I want to keep some sense of self intact, then I really do have to go off on my own and stop asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also something that struck me about your book is, as you were saying, the people you interviewed are extremely rational in one sense, but they're also at the same time very idiosyncratic when it comes to kind of understanding their political interests. And I think one really interesting frame that you put forward in your book is you call it pain management, right? So you sort of talk about how the working class interviewees, on the one hand, as you were saying, they lots of them have what we might call a structural critique, right? Like they understand that sort of external factors beyond their control are shaping their lives, that there's rampant economic inequality and, racial inequality of all kinds, that the economy is essentially rigged and that, is more or less designed to redistribute wealth upward. And at the same time, they can articulate all of that, but they also turn inward. And as Ariella was saying, they sort of turn to these narratives of self-help. You mentioned in your book, a lot of your interviewees kind of thank God for the opportunities that they have been afforded, or they actually thank God for the hardships that have come to them, which they sort of recast as opportunities. And again, I really like sort of your frame of pain management, because in the county you study, there's also a lot of opioid dependency. So I feel like that was kind of like a double meaning there, right? So So can you kind of flesh out this concept of pain management and talk a little bit about this inward turn?
Sure. So this was kind of another example of, I would ask people, all of my interview questions was about like policies and politicians they liked, and, do you feel patriotic? And people would sort of shift away from those questions in the interview, and they'd focus on their own lives. And I think for many of them, it was kind of therapeutic to tell me about their lives. And, pain was so central to their stories that I made an argument about pain being sort of a central organizing feature of working class lives. And so they would tell their story as a kind of arc where they would, experience extreme suffering, and then they would hit a point where they realized that they had to protect themselves, and that this pain had made them stronger, that it served a purpose in their lives. And from there, for example, they might say, I, was addicted to heroin, and I had a very troubled, abusive childhood, and everything kind of went wrong for me. But I reached a point where I realized only I could save myself. I was the only one who could detox. I don't want any medicine to detox. I want to do it myself and learn the hard way. And that's kind of how life should work. So they were like very proud of that. Mm-hmm. And that would kind of lead them to, I think, two ways of thinking about the world, both of which ended up in political withdrawal. So self-help literature, and this idea that you can heal yourself, you can heal your heart. That was something that especially women focused on. And also conspiracy theory. So kind of searching for signs that the world is not to be trusted, and that everything is rigged against you, and you could outsmart it. You could understand that was going on, and you could organize your lives so you could protect yourself against it.
Yeah, I want to talk about the conspiracy theory element, because one of the subjects in the book, like, very plainly is like, the US government will try to kill you. And many of the others echo this idea that, systems are set up in a rational way to explain the tremendous amount of pain that they're in, or the suffering that they see around them. And I think that it's pretty reasonable. I mean, having grown up in poverty myself and used government assistance, I think I came to that conclusion as a kid as well. I was like, this is not set up to be easy or accessible. I remember getting really sick and getting denied care because they said, oh, we don't see Medicaid patients. You start to think like, there must be some reason that this is happening to me. And you can either go towards a broad abstraction that explains almost mythologically why these systems constantly are mismanaged, right? And it provides a rationale for that, which is eliminating a good portion of the American populace in some instances. And then you also can turn inward and say, I can only develop myself. And I think that's also a rational response to shifting the risk onto individuals, right? So all of these institutions that are promising to help people with really dire issues like opioid addiction or housing insecurity, food insecurity, job loss, they end up transferring the risk onto individuals as much of the capitalist economy does. And these individuals make the rational decision to say, well, if it's going to be me anyways, I'm cutting myself off from these other predatory institutions, and I'm not relying on anything else. So I wanted to see if you could go into more of the psychology of this demobilization, the rationale, and also why conspiracy theories lay at the center of creating narratives around these dynamics for people.
That's such a good question. So it's like when you listen to their stories, and the stories they tell about their lives, they are giving their lives a sense of meaning and purpose, so that it doesn't really feel random, but they organize their stories in a way that kind of tries to make everything make sense and everything have a purpose. And in some ways, like it's very easy for them, as you just said, to take experiences from their everyday lives and construct a narrative about institutions actively seeking to harm them, because they actually are. So, for example, many of the Black women I spoke with talked about how a local hospital, when they showed up and said they were pregnant, would offer them like an abortion pill or offer them birth control. And it's like, for them, like that was like a very clear example of an institution attempting to harm them, or attempting to harm their baby, or being drug tested at the hospital after giving birth, even they had no prior drug use at all. And so it's like, clearly this is not like coming out of nowhere. It's not just paranoia. There's lots of evidence in their lives. Like same thing with like Black men and Hispanic men in the book who were constantly being pulled over or put in jail for things that they hadn't done, while the white men are marching in their militias with their guns around town. So I think, and for the white men too, there's also lots of examples of institutions not working in their best interests as working class men and women. So I mean, I think then there's sort of almost like a line where that's happening in your everyday life, you start to see like all kinds of examples of that happening. So it can go into, for example, oh, there's the fluoride in the water is about mind control and making sure we don't rise up against the government, or when you see a plane going in the air and there seems to be smoke coming out of it, like that's population control, or camps. And it's really hard to say like what's rational and what's not, because of course there are real conspiracies, and there are for example like drinking water in Michigan or something. Like there's lots of examples of governments hiding things that hurt people and not caring about poor people. But I do think it gave people a sense of pride and control to feel like if they were smart enough and stayed alert and they used their phones to do their own research, they could avoid being brainwashed. And so they would take these very radical critiques. For example, they'd say, like, I'm not going to be like proud of the military. Like, the US is a bully. And, if they send me overseas, it's just to like, fight against other like poor, disadvantaged people. And it's all for money and it doesn't mean anything. So they could take a really like radical critique, but then at the same time, then start talking about fluoride, or start talking about how the attacks on 9/11, not only were they profitable, which ended up being true, but that they also never happened, and that it was all like a way to control us. And so, but then you're like, well, that I think that also makes a lot of sense. And there's lots of places in the internet where you can get lost in conspiracy theories. And if someone says that's not true, you say, well, you're just part of the cover up. And so it kind of becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
It also seems to replace, in the same way that the white supremacist groups do, the social bonds that you might have gotten from other groups. Like if you're in a union, you have a critique of your boss and your relationship to them that's based in your relationship to other workers and your relationship to other industries.
If you don't have a union, maybe you have QAnon.
Yeah. And maybe if you don't have a community center and you feel alone and you're suffering and pain, that feeling, no matter who you are, makes you want to reach out until nobody's there to help. It's so primitive. And I mean that in a good way. It's like what a baby does, right? They feel pain. They want to see their pain reflected in another person who cares and can ameliorate it. And a lot of these conspiracy theories, they're not just focusing on, for instance, QAnon. It provides a narrative to people who feel like they've lost their kids. And that can be from opioid addiction or from any other number of things. Or anti-vaccination, people who talk about the health of other people in their community as though it's very important and really matters, and they help them navigate these things that they don't have the resources to navigate. So it seems like it can spiral into the realm of like the fantastical in some of the anecdotes that you have in your book. You are reading stuff that just seems like, wildly ineffective at what they think it's supposed to do, right? Even as a conspiracy. But it seems to have reoriented social bonds.
I think that's true, but not, as you said, in the local union or the local bar or church, but instead on the internet with people who are not with you in real time. Like they're, say you say, oh, there's fluoride controlling my mind. If someone like that you trust locally is like, that's not true, like maybe you'll rethink it. But on the internet, you can easily just talk to people who agree with you. And so there, you don't have a lot of local organizing, or you don't have a lot of local conversation. And why would you if you don't really trust the people around you or you think they're dangerous?
So what I wanted to ask you is, we've talked about kind of this inward turn and people moving away from politics and sort of retreating to self-help. And something that you mentioned in your book is that obviously, in some ways, this is very worrying. It sort of creates a chicken and egg situation where when people are kind of deprived of social institutions, they, obviously, as we've been saying, retreat sort of inward, and then that further removes them from the political process. But something that you talk about in your book is that it's not necessarily all bad. or you identify that there might be some moments of hope in there. Can you talk about how your interviewees kind of found dignity and community while they were sort of participating in this inward turn, and like where we might be able to go from there?
Yeah. So the way I was thinking about this was, typically we think about how do we connect the individual up to a collective, and it seems like the way I was expecting them to do that was through social class, maybe an identify as a working class person identifying as a worker, but that didn't really seem to be happening. So it was like almost like I was trying to find a different like mediating construct that people could use to connect the individual up to a larger group. And I was at a group that met every week for families who had a family member suffering from addiction. And I was just sitting there. And one of the things I noticed was that in this group, people would share stories of suffering. And it was a place where people would not only empathize, but they'd also like share advice. Like, have you thought about applying for a housing voucher? Or, if you think about what to do in order to get medical assistance, and how might we make this was like totally run just by like everyday people. There were no medical experts, but they were meeting together to solve problems. And I thought, well, okay, could pain be this mediating construct, that if people could share their pain, could they also then start to think about the causes of this pain in a more collective way? And in this group, people would say, like, look at these pharmaceutical companies and this doctor where, first they prescribe my kids, all these prescriptions, and then they get addicted, and now they're prescribing them things to get off of the medicine, and it's all about making money off of them. Or politicians, maybe they say politicians keep offering them like handouts, but that will just make them not work, and just all these ways of looking at a bigger picture. And so I thought, well, possibly maybe going forward, we're not going to be talking about our identity as workers in class. Maybe we'll talk about the way that we experience pain, even in a very intimate way, but also start to connect that up to larger institutions and larger political processes. I mean, I think one reviewer told me that they thought this was sort of like a pie in the sky idea that, wouldn't be practical, but I didn't really see any other way that could connect people, especially across like race and gender, in a way that where they could speak the same language and then start to think about bigger processes.
Yeah, and it seems like in the absence of other institutions, there is a shared experience there, which is remarkable because the way that you've structured the book, you're kind of bracketing off different racial or ethnic groups and saying, here's how this group of people is understanding what's happening in their community. And that's also based on like the duration of time that they've lived there. So there's another dimension. But every single one of them has a through line of this kind of, deeply, deeply personal pain that is not in any way ameliorated by the things that should be helping it. And it's interesting that it draws out some of those idiosyncratic beliefs, because it's like they seem to be really compassionate in certain moments, right? And then broadly discriminatory in others. But there is a through line of compassion saying, well, people who really need help, they should be getting help, right? But we don't want people to abuse it. So I was wondering if you could talk about, in the last election, we saw a kind of wave of progressive policies in places where people wouldn't really expect it, particularly with Florida and the $15 minimum wage. And it seems like your book really gets at that. Like, reading about these subjects, they may say, oh, I'm a Republican, or I never vote, or my dad was a Democrat, but, the lizard people are running things now. But when you talk to them about real policies, they're like, yeah, we should have healthcare. People are suffering. I want drug addiction available. So can you talk about the potential for, the left channeling some of that pain into progressive ballot measures and organizing around those shared experiences?
Yeah, I mean, there was a real sense that as Americans, or as workers, that people did deserve to be part of a social contract, and that, like, the idea that you wouldn't have basic healthcare, basic opportunities like quality education, or just basic quality housing that was safe for your children. Like, people like they weren't rejecting help at all. They were thinking, why is it that we have, these billionaires are making so much money, and the politicians are making so much money, but I can't even live when I like make these sacrifices. And so that instinct was there, for sure, in a way that I think surprised me. So, and I think the left could absolutely channel this idea of, you are like working hard, or you have kids and they deserve opportunity, and the government's job is to provide these basic necessities. I think the hang up, it ends up being about who deserves them and who doesn't in certain cases, when for example, if you think refugees or only underrepresented minorities, whatever, are getting this and I'm not, people get resentful, or people who don't work hard are getting them, but I work really hard. And so it's like, maybe you'd have to think about, I think in one sense, if people didn't feel like resources were so scarce and there were enough to go around, I think that could help that a lot, because if you felt like you were getting what you needed, I think you wouldn't be so angry about other people who seem to get more than they needed. So I think that could be like one way of thinking about that.
Yeah, you have a story in your book about one of your interviewees says something like, I'm a big entitlements guy. Like I come from like a proud union household that always supported like working class policies and old school democratic politicians. Like, I'm a big entitlements guy. And then he says, like, literally minutes later, like, but we don't like handouts. And like, and like the kind of distinction between the two things, which you might think of as synonymous, I think is really interesting. And again, just shows how your interview subjects are both extremely rational, but also pretty idiosyncratic. And like, I just want to say again, like, I loved reading those stories. Like, I think that the fact that these people are so idiosyncratic, like, made them extremely human. Ariella and I, who both grew up, not in major cities, in kind of small towns, like, we were like, hey, like, we know all these people, so it was very deeply humanizing.
Oh, thank you. I feel like in sociology, some people were like, well, we need more like categories, or you need ways to group them. And I felt like, no, I'm in this book, I'm actually going to I'm going to show everything that doesn't fit into my categories. And I'm going to try to explain it with this lens of pain, but also understand that I just feel like you had to get to know the whole person. And in the case you're bringing up, this is someone who really did believe in government providing opportunity, but he had been feeling this like increasing sense of meaninglessness in life, where he really did believe that everything now has been about profit, and that there was no more sense of like helping each other and caring about a whole. This was a sense he learned when he was in Vietnam, and now he still has it. So he kept saying nothing means anything anymore. And, he's looking at his own children who are suffering from addiction, and he's saying, is it because they weren't able to develop their soul and spirit through jobs and hard work? Is that what happened to them? Is that why they turned to drugs? He's sort of like grasping for straws to understand this is the extremely painful, extremely scary experience of children who have a heroin addiction, and he's helpless. And so it's like people are just trying to piece together everything any way that they can. And again, I think it kind of goes back to this lack of community, and maybe a lack of way of putting all those pieces together in a narrative that is more consistent.
Yeah, a lot of these stories reminded me of people that I grew up with, and the through line of military service was particularly interesting. In my town, it's very similar to where you did your field work. There's a volunteer fire department, volunteer EMTs, lots of military service, particularly among, like my cohort from high school who came up with the Iraq War. The foundation laid perfectly for rural kids to go and fight. And there was a kid in my town who served in Iraq. He came back. He had extreme PTSD and didn't recover. There's no resources really for healthcare. So a lot of people are underinsured. And he committed suicide, and his father and grandfather were on the volunteer fire department service, and they responded to that because it's such a small town, and it it crushes people. It crushes these bonds for years and years and years. And you see it fracture out in a community, these like really grim moments. And what I saw was my town, that was mostly Republican and conservative, but again, very, very similar libertarian ideas, super, super liberal left ideas, completely get behind Trump. And they really, he appealed to them because he was an outsider. He was constantly being ridiculed and scorned by establishment people who would say, oh, he's just a failed businessman. He's a failed billionaire. He's gone bankrupt. Not knowing, as your book so astutely points out, that personal development through failure is like one of the cornerstones of people's identities in communities where failure is extremely common.
Right. And these elites saying, oh, he failed. It's like the worst.
Yeah,
right?
It seems like
they feel that condescension all the time.
Or doing his work for him, basically.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the appeal of Trump to some of the participants in your book and why they liked his less savory aspects for liberals, right? Him being blatantly racist or him being crude or crass. To them was a virtue. They were like, he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the political establishment.
I also want to add on to that not all of the Trump fans in your study were white. And so that's another kind of aspect of his appeal.
Yeah, there are definitely things about him that appealed to people, even if they would also say, yeah, I know he's racist, or yeah, I know he's probably not going to be good for me. And so I think a big one was that he seemed to speak his mind and he didn't seem constrained by political correctness. And he would just, even if they didn't agree with what he was saying, they liked his style, I think, because he sort of challenged this very like elitist idea of how you're supposed to talk and how you're supposed to look. And so it was almost like a breath of fresh air for them to see someone who might talk like them or who didn't care. And I think him being a billionaire, what they liked about that story, on top of this idea that he had remade himself several times, was that they believed that he wasn't doing it for the money, where they believed almost all politicians were just in this game because they wanted to make money off of, with lobbyists or big corporations. And that this, I think it kind of goes back to this idea that they believe politicians would do anything to stay in power. And even if that meant, offering, they would say, well, politicians will offer too many handouts because then they'll get votes in a way that they thought actually hurt people. It's like, that's how the logic worked. And they thought, well, okay, well, Trump doesn't care about staying in power. He has all this other stuff. So maybe he'll actually just for 4 years do the right thing, do something we need, and bring back our kind of sense of pride. And so, many people, even people who didn't vote for him because they didn't vote, still kind of liked him or were entertained by him. And there were all kinds of signs up everywhere, lock her up and, Trump digs coal and all of that around.
Have you followed up with your interviewees since the book or since, kind of 20?
Yeah, I've kept in touch with a handful of them. And most people, I think, who voted for Trump still kind of liked him or liked his style versus, although would also kind of be like, okay, you are kind of, even if they did start to think, okay, you're kind of a racist, or maybe we don't like this, what you're saying. But I think there was still a lot of support for him, and people, I think in general, people often double down on their decisions, no matter what they believe, because it becomes part of their story or identity as well. And you had asked me about like people of color who voted for Trump or who liked Trump as well. This is interesting. I actually got to be on a panel like a month ago with a political scientist at Michigan named Vince Hutchings, and he was making the point that we should be cautious about this story of people of color voting for Trump, because it did seem, at least in polling, that the number, like the percentage of Black or Hispanic people like saying they would vote for Trump wasn't really out of the range of normal for voting for a Republican, and that it is still the case that the vast majority of people of color preferred Democrats. And so he was sort of saying like the real interesting part here is just how consistent people of color in preferring Democrats. Not that this was an outlier, but and I would say in my sample, the people who seem to prefer Trump, part of it was like the bravado, but I think it was also about networks. So if, for example, like there was one Black man who had married a white woman who was from the coal region and was really integrated into her family and community. And there, I think, Trump, it was more about the social situation he was in, that it seemed Trump seemed to be a good person.
Yeah. I think for me, at least, some of the kind of narrative that I've been really interested in about, the people of color who voted for Trump is not, I mean, as you say, I think that it's totally true, or it seems objectively true that, the vast majority of people of color in the US, did not vote for Trump, and also that it wasn't outside the range of, the number of people of color who usually vote for Republicans.
Who voted for Reagan or something. Yeah.
Exactly. That said, I think the interesting thing is that in very specific areas, you saw a shift from how people voted in 2016 to 2020. So, there have been, a growing number of studies that show that in a lot of like immigrant neighborhoods, or, in like Texas border towns, communities or neighborhoods or districts that had voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, shifted to Trump. And I actually think that's connected in some ways to a lot of what you talk about in your book, which is that, when institutions continue to fail people, they will look to other explanations. I don't think the story is as simple as, oh, well, the Democrats, failed, and so now people are voting Republican. But it goes back to what you were saying about Trump being kind of an unusual sort of figure, even if, we know that he was not good for workers, not good for people of color. Something about his affect or about the way that the establishment was talking about him did appeal somehow. So that's really interesting.
I think that's true. Yeah, the just not caring about the rules. I think not caring about the rules of elite institutions.
There's also an anecdote. Sorry. I was going to say there's an anecdote in your book by a person who works as like a freelance contractor. And he explicitly talks about how Trump repealing the penalty for not having insurance was cheaper for him. And I think that that's something that a lot of people experienced. People who are working as contractors with this piecemeal work, who are technically small business owners because they're self-employed, and who are getting hit by these pretty extreme penalties if they don't purchase insurance on the marketplace for $600 a month. They really felt like, oh, you know what my life is. You've targeted something that will immediately help me. And I remember listening to this clip where this woman was like, I don't want Hillary's hot sauce in her bag. I want Trump's tax cuts in my wallet. And it seemed like, a lot of people, they're not just completely driven by, I'm an anti-racist, so I'm an anti-racist voter, right? Like, they are keenly aware of every single financial aspect of their life and every single thing that a trade-off, even of a couple dollars, would do to it. And that seems to be like a part in your book where all of your subjects can talk about their financial situations, their debt, and relate that to how they make decisions in their life. And sometimes that is the justification for them being completely politically disengaged. And other times it's an explanation for them saying, well, at least, this guy, this jackal in the set of jackals isn't going to lie to me like the other ones, and maybe I'll get a little something out of it.
Yeah, that's right. And there were people in my book who voted for Obama in 2012 or 2008, and they thought, oh, he's going to fix all of my healthcare problems. And then it turned out that it didn't. And, people would say, I still can't really afford this, and there's this penalty, and my health is terrible. And so they kind of gave up and either stopped voting or would say, okay, maybe Trump can help me with this. And I think that is consistent with findings about how there were like large swaths of white working class people who left Democratic Party after Obama, and kind of because they were so disillusioned or disappointed. So yeah, you're right. It's like completely economically rational thinking about, okay, who's going to get my health back? This is what I need so I can work.
Your book has a lot of people who are like very open about wanting armed violence and insurrection. And there are two current examples that seem to be explained a lot by what the subjects in your book say. So the first is the Capitol riot. The second is the response to lockdown. And it seems to me that the second response, the response to lockdown, people talked about it being astroturfed by conservative groups, you know, telling people, make a sign being like, I need to get a haircut and so on. But some of the people seem to genuinely be suffering at the deprivation of social interaction. And when you read these stories, it makes a lot of sense because people are extremely isolated already. And maybe the only place that they have to interact with people is like the pizza parlor or the Lions Club or, you know, a local community group. And they had already, prior to the pandemic, said, like, they're going to try to take everything from me. I have to have as many guns as possible and arm myself so that they can't pull me away from my people, basically. And so to me, after having read this, both of those responses kind of make a lot more sense. I was wondering if you could talk about your perspective on both the pandemic protests and the Capitol riot.
Sure, yeah. So in 2015 and 2016, I did meet a handful of white working class men who told me explicitly that they were preparing for war and that there was a race war coming and we were going to fight it out in the streets. And one person actually had created his own militia and they would hold drills and have like take back our town rallies and, you know, purposely walk by the houses of people of color. And then the people of color were kind of scared, especially like 4th of July parades would be kind of scared to leave their house. And, you know, the people of color were very aware of institutionalized racism and policing and racial profiling, but at that point weren't really protesting it actively. So in some ways, this idea that like a race war is coming, like when the insurgency happened and all these open protests also around like the monuments in the South, especially, like this was stuff that I kind of almost was ready for because I had heard from these people. And in the beginning, I think people who'd hear me present would say like, who are these crazies you rounded up? But it turns out like they definitely were kind of I was tapping into something that was going on, this idea that we have to take control, we have to take to the streets, we can't count on the government to defend us. And also this idea that the government was trying to control us. So we had to go out on our own. I think, you know, I think with the lockdown, it was intense fear. People would say it's going to be martial law, like we're going to lose all of our rights and we have to be ready to fight. And so I think that happened too. On top of the social part where, I mean, they didn't want to be told what to do by the government for sure. And then I know in the Coal region, one of my former respondents told me that so bars would make bars and like fire clubs, which were attached, would say like, okay, well, you can drink here, but you have to always like or be eating while you're drinking, so you don't stay all night. So then people would order like one plate of French fries and still stay all night drinking, you know, to like really kind of protest that. So yeah, I think it was about the feeling like mind control or social control was happening too.
And these groups were already in place, so it wasn't like suddenly something happens or Trump snaps his fingers. And then
they were holding their drills. They were practicing. They would literally say, "I'm preparing for war," and they would be serious. And I think I was kind of like, "Ha ha." You know, like, how do I respond to that?
Were you surprised when you saw the Capitol riots after having talked to people who were
honestly? Yeah, not really. And I had done another project with Brookings like a few months ago where I also ended up talking to a few like rural white men who had been at the Unite the Right rally, but who were also talking very seriously about, and these men were kind of also like economically very leftist, but were still thinking they had to take to the streets, and they were really into being white and really into tracing their lineage back to the Mayflower and, you know, how they were the real Americans who had to defend it. And they were definitely into like having guns and being so afraid the government would take their guns away. So not really, I would say. I wasn't that surprised that they would at least this for sure.
One thing that you point out is that in the absence of like other status markers or way of being valued, like I have this job and this is, you know, my home that I can definitely afford and I'm not at risk of losing and so on and so forth, they default to a masculine identity of being the protector because they can't be the provider. And it seems like a lot of these kind of broadly more popular conspiracy theories, like QAnon feeding into the riots, or COVID is a hoax, feeding into like armed marches to reopen towns, comes from this long-standing sense of like white male identity as protector and aggrieved provider, being robbed of the right to provide, being robbed of the right to thrive. And then this gets articulated through white supremacy, because white supremacy in America has always been an economic program. It's just only for white people. It's not just about, we want the right to hate people of color, we want the right to build walls, we want the right to, kill or attack them. It's also how wealth is distributed, and it clearly articulates it. And the problem with privilege politics is that privilege politics is like, yes, that's correct. Like, that is why you have everything. It's because you're white. And so when people are hearing that and they don't have very much, or they feel like it's slipping through their grasp, it seems like in your book you make the case that all they have left is the role of protector.
I think that's true. It's in the coal region. You can see this long history of, white men being in unions and making sure they kept Black men into the most menial jobs, and if the economy was like not doing well, Black men would be the first to lose the job. So there was certainly an racial and economic hierarchy that was like long rooted. And this was also a place where, if there were a few examples that were almost recent, people told me about, of Black families trying to move in and sort of being driven out with threats of violence. And I do think it is all kind of hang together. But for many of the white men, a big part of their identity was a provider, and they saw themselves as being willing to sacrifice their bodies and do anything to bring home money, but they couldn't really do that anymore. And they also had lost a lot of authority in the family that I think came from that role. So, they were also dealing with, having kids and they weren't married, or their marriage is not lasting, or feeling like their wives didn't respect them. And, so I do think that kind of like protector role became magnified for them. It's protecting your wife, protecting your children, or your, girlfriend or partner, showing your strength through like violence, versus like, a solid worker identity. I think that did become really important for them.
So I have a question. It's slightly outside of the scope of your book, maybe, but when I was reading about kind of this working class turn inward, it made me think about the professional managerial class also, perhaps because we did an episode about the PMC just last time. I think obviously for different reasons and in very different conditions than, your working class subjects, I think a lot of professional managerial class people have also sort of turned inward. So instead of the language of self-help, it's maybe the language of self-care, right?
Right.
Or,
development.
Development. Yeah, like working on the self. And also, I think, this is a group of people who are probably still more politically engaged in some ways, but at the same time, like I was recently looking at Lena Dunham's Instagram, and she had a little graphic that said reparations must be interpersonal and ongoing. And to me, that seemed like an example again.
So painful. It's so painful.
Right. Right. But it seemed like a kind of obviously an effort to engage politically, or to kind of express a political affiliation, but at the same time, it was so individualized, right? Like reparations must be, quote, interpersonal. So I'm wondering,
or like taking care of myself is politically active because
right, exactly, no. Right. Right. Yeah. So I'm wondering, I guess my question is, even though obviously there's a huge, vast difference between, people who sort of turn inward as pain management, as you put it, and then kind of like the PMC/Goop style of turning inward, is there a connection between the two, or are they both symptoms of something larger?
That's a great question. Every example you gave made me want to just vomit on screen so bad. So there's a sociologist named Eva Illouz, and there's also been some work done on this by Ofer Sharon at MIT. But I think this actual therapeutic language actually did originate within the professional managerial class. And it originated actually in the workplace. And it was all about kind of self-development and basically taking control of your own emotions and learning how to manage yourself as a worker. And it seems like kind of teaching everyone to be an independent contractor. And I think this language seeped kind of into the intimate sphere for the professional managerial class, where it's about managing yourself, and right, you do self-care so that you're become like a more productive, kind of happier person, and learning, basically learning how to take control of your own emotions instead of thinking about any other kind of life. And it was only a few years ago, actually, I found this in my first book, Coming Up Short, which is to think about how this language is transformed and picked up by working class people. And so the narrative of like self-control and managing one's own emotion and harnessing them for growth is part of the working class self, for sure, now, in ways that lots of people thought like, oh, if you're working class, you're worried about survival, you're not thinking about, emotional self-help, but you actually are. And this emotional self-help really dovetails with the story of how you have to basically take control of your own fate and not depend on other people, which is like really convenient for the capitalism. And so I do think, there is a way that maybe it manifests slightly differently because of resources, but the idea of an emotional self that you have to take care of or harness seems to be everywhere in our culture. Who was your guest for professional managerial class?
Oh, it was Catherine Liu. Do you know her?
I love her. Yes, I'm reading her book as well.
She was amazing.
A few years ago. She's the funniest tweeter I've ever met, and I just love her too. Okay.
Oh, we need to do a show where both of you are on, because Coming Up Short is exactly a kind of parallel to some of the things that she talks about in her book about the professional managerial class, virtue hoarders, where this sort of like emotional self-development and emotional psychotherapy development is like a type of social good. Which I think is also part of the like, men will literally read everything about Star Wars before going to therapy kind of shift on Twitter. And I think people really think it's kind of only nested in middle class or upper middle class people, but Coming Up Short follows working class younger people taking up these ideas and trying to understand how broad systemic failures, once again, like student loan debt or inability to have a consistent long-term relationship because of precarity in a person's life, how those can become like stepping stones on the road to self-development. And it's kind of crushing to read because they really end up foregoing all types of social bonds and doubling down on the social poverty that they're already experiencing. It's very, very good. And I wish we could have you talk about that one next. We'll have to have you come back on the show.
Maybe we'll come with Catherine and I'll talk about it.
Yeah, that would be great.
Hero. Oh, yeah.
I think this is a good place to wrap up. I really want to thank you for taking time to talk to us. I know that it's hard to carve it out.
You two are amazing interviewers, and I learned a lot from you, and it was really fun.
Yeah. We'll definitely have you back to talk about Coming Up Short.
So fun.
And
I'll deal with my lighting issues before then.
We'll pass along your fandom to Catherine also.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
We should have you both on a panel. You can just talk about the self-care industry broadly across class.
Yeah.
Rural, urban.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be great.
That sounds good.
Thank you so much. This was great.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you.